do I think of them? Well, I'd say something supernatural happened. I'm happy to say that. Second, I'm not necessarily against it being married. Now, as a Protestant, I'm not inclined that way theologically, but there's nothing in my theology that would say it could not have been married. Third, I'd say she never spoke. Whatever it was, never spoke, never ID'd itself. People saw different things. This is very different, appears, than what we come to the resurrection appearances of Jesus. And the narratives from your book, I know that you'd say, well, how do you know that they all saw the same thing? And I think that's a decent question. My answer to that would be, well, you look at the resurrection narratives, the way they're reported there, in all the accounts except for Mark, who doesn't have any, they all seem to be suggesting that they were seeing the same thing. Now, of course, you might come back and say, yeah, but how do we know that we can trust the resurrection narratives that, that they're exactly as they were? Well, without getting into a lot of back and forth with you here, because I know I got to give others time here, I'm going to trust them more than you do, that they are preserving historical recollections closer to how they occurred than you'd be willing to do.
I don't have a response except to ask, why are you saying it might be married? Why aren't you saying it is married? Because
she never identifies herself, and they all saw different things. I mean, you got two guys, two laborers, and one laborer said he saw what just seemed to be a figure with an outline, and the other one, I forgot what it was, but a little girl. And then there was a woman there who was an agnostic. I think she was a professor visiting. She said she didn't really see anything except some kind of a figure, but it was nothing like what the others saw.
That's true. But if you read the first-hand accounts, they're not saying, I interpreted a nebulous light. They're saying it was just like Mary. So it's just like the resurrection narratives. How do they know it's Jesus? How do they know it's Jesus? Because he looks like the Jesus they know.
How about he identified himself?
Maybe so. Okay. Does he say, so in Matthew 28, he doesn't identify himself.
Doesn't he commission them in the end?
Yeah, he does. I mean, it just assumes that they recognize him.
Yeah, and in Matthew, earlier on, he predicts his death and resurrection, tells them to go to Galilee, just as Mark says, that after I have been raised, I will go to Galilee, there you will see me, just as, there you will see me.
Mike and Dale, just a quick question. Would it be relevant to include here the Fatima official apparitions in and the beginning of the 20th century in Portugal, and the fact that she identifies herself 3 times with a message that dominates the Vatican with relative to Mariology throughout the 20th century?
Well, although that's just to the children, not to the...
Yes, but the message is received as something for the whole church.
Okay, so just to make sure, I don't want to pursue this any further, but your answer, Mike, is that she didn't say, I am Mary, and if she had, you then would think it was.
She didn't say anything, right?
She did not say anything.
I mean, there was
but the
nothing.
Catholic Christians will tell you that people were healed. They'll also, they have some early photographs they'll share. Of course, there's always discussion about photographs because everything can be touched up. But the vast majority of people say they saw Mary and that she looked like the Mary of their artwork. Okay, so that's how they identify her. You are right. There are occasionally people who will say, I didn't see anything, or others who said, I just saw a vague light. But there are others who say, I saw nothing, and then I saw a vague light, and then she resolved herself into Mary. You have all these different things. I'm still, if you want to say you trust the New Testament accounts, fine, but I still have no idea how we know that the disciples saw exactly the same thing or experienced the same thing. And I do know that whatever happened after their experience they were not 12 independent witnesses who never talked to each other. They processed what happened together, so their testimony has to contaminate each other.
Well, would you allow me just one follow-up? And I don't want to hog this. So, I know from reading your work, which is awesome. I think that the Gospels are far closer to the eyewitnesses than you do. So let's just take, for example, Mark, and let's take John. I know that you think the Gospel of John, the author is relying on much of the tradition from John the son of Zebedee. And I don't know what you think about Mark, but I do think that Mark is writing what he heard from Peter. Much of it is based on that. Luke's getting his information from Paul and some others and other eyewitnesses and those who knew them. Their reports about the resurrection appearances, Jesus is speaking to them as a group. He's allowing them to touch them. He's eating in front of them. And Johnny actually fixes breakfast for them. It seems that they are seeing the same thing. That's very different from Mary and the way things are described at Zeitung.
Well, okay, I just don't see that. I'm sorry, I don't see how we know what they were seeing. Again, I suppose I need to say I'm a Christian, and I think Jesus rose from the dead, but I'm also a critical historian, and I think that we should have questions about a story that was put down for the first time decades after the alleged event. So you referred to Mark, but Mark has no appearance story. The appearance story that's there now after 16:8 is secondary. It's from the second century. Right? Yeah, he says, I'll appear to you. He goes before you into Galilee, but there's no description of anything. There are no details. We get those later on. But, I think Matthew was probably written in the 80s. I think Luke's probably written, I'm actually conservative on this. I think Luke's probably could be written in the 70s, maybe late 70s. But they're not giving you first-hand accounts from people who were there. Luke wasn't there.
What about the early creedal traditions and the Acts sermon summaries as being far before the gospel narratives?
I don't have any trouble here whatsoever.
I know you don't. That's
no. I think, but 1 Corinthians 15 is a bare bones outline, and it doesn't give you the stories, and it doesn't give you the first-hand testimony of those involved.
Well,
until you get to the bottom, and you have Paul to talk about himself. But Paul is also really frustrating, because the detailed accounts we have from Paul are not from Paul; they're from Acts. Paul just refers to his event. He doesn't give us details about it.
You have the Acts sermon summaries in Acts 1 through 5, 10, and 13, where they are narrated, but you get the really early sections like with C.H. Dodd and others who point out the Acts sermon summaries are closer to narration than Paul's creed, for sure.
Yeah, but see, my skeptical scenario, which I don't believe, I just defend, my skeptical scenario has no problem with 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. It says it's all real. Sure. Just says it all happened. We just have to interpret it from a reductionistic point of view, which I don't do.
Again, what do you think about the narration in the Acts sermon summaries? The passages that Dodd recognizes as going back to the...
Yeah.
Actually, it says going back to the apostles. In his book,
Apostolic Preaching.
And his developments, correct?
He does.
Good source.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's just very complicated. I think Acts 2 is later. I think Acts 3 is primitive. So it just depends on the source. I think Acts 7 is based on a source. But again, I don't see how that gets to the point here, which is if you're going to be a skeptic and say, well, I think some people thought Jesus appeared to them, then you're not going to bat an eye at passages that say he appeared to them. Well, that's what they thought.
There are people who are unbelievers, scholars, who have studied the data and become believers.
Can you name somebody?
I can name a number. Ponnenberg, for one, in his early days. But how about Tipler? Do you know him, the physicist?
Yeah.
He wrote to me. I was surprised when I opened up my emails one day, and he's on my email, and he writes to me. He wrote a book, and part of the book was aimed at Tony Flew and I in our first debate, and he says, Flew won this debate, Habermas lost. All right, so after he said that in this one book, he writes an email to me, he goes, hey, you know that book I wrote where I said you lost the debate? Yeah. I've changed my mind, I'm a Christian, Christ was raised from the dead, and I now think you won the debate.
Yeah.
These are years later, but he was a clear unbeliever, an atheist.
Is Tipler in this room? I think he's a very strange thinker. So I'll just leave it with that. I read 2 things by him, and I thought they were very strange.
For you folks who are here, he's a mathematical physicist, so he runs in those places where he does most of his speaking in math. Anyway.
As far as Ponnenberg goes, I've never found Ponnenberg's autobiography, but in Jesus, God, and Man, he gives his reasons for why he thinks Jesus rose from the dead, and he gives them as historical reasons. And this is actually what got me started on this subject years ago, because I read that book in the 1970s, and I remember standing up after I finished that section and asking myself, what did he just do? Did he do what he claimed to do?
He's like you. He doesn't like the gospel narratives, but he argues the case from the early traditions.
No.
He does.
I
love
love the gospel narratives. I love Luke. I love Matthew. I love John. I love Mark. There's a difference between loving a narrative and then evaluating it historically and deciding, well, I think this might be late, or I think this is early, or I just don't know what to think.
That's why I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing with the early traditions and Ponnenberg. I'll even give you pages if you want, pages 104 to 108 in Jesus, God, and Man. He gives a long argument from the early traditions of the Acts narratives, the Acts sermon summaries, not the book of Acts, sermon summaries, like Dodd, and argues that the resurrection occurred, and he has a section that says it occurred in such a way that we can argue that God is the one that raised from the dead. And anybody who looks at this from a Jewish, this is Ponnenberg, anybody who looks at this from from a Jewish perspective will say, God is the one who raised Jesus from the dead, therefore Jesus' worldview is true. That's Ponnenberg with Jesus, God, and Man.
Okay, I don't know how to respond to that, except I would put my knowledge of Wolfhard Ponnenberg up against anybody's. I know almost everything you were saying.
Check those pages.
Not convinced. No,
Check those pages in Jesus, God, and Man.
Those pages are completely marked up.
So are mine, in about 5 different
Well,
colors.
we're just disagreeing. Okay? Look, enough said.
Andrew?
There's others.
Yes. So I think, Dale, I think you're missing a point which I make in my presentation earlier, where I argue that the details concerning what the disciples claim to have saw would have been proclaimed from the very earliest days of Christianity, because the disciples wouldn't, the audience of the disciples wouldn't be happy if I just tell you, Jesus raised from the dead, they appeared to 12 people. I mean, they will surely ask, right, what did you see, right? So, what did the Pharisees? So these details must have been told from the earliest days. And I also argue, based on a lot of considerations, that these details will have been carefully remembered, preserved in the tradition, because these are foundational to the Christian faith. And these stories are important. They are life and death for these people, and they can't be easily changed given their foundational nature, and also given their shocking nature. It's like something that will remain in their memory, very strongly, clearly remembered, and they will be repeatedly told, right? So, for example, if I misremembered the Lord's Prayer, right, next week, if I go to church again, people will correct me, right? I miss out some phrase. And so, given all these considerations, and also that we have multiple independent sources that converge on the common elements that Jesus did identify himself, as Mike Icona was saying just now, Now this is totally different from the Zyklin case, where the appearance didn't say anything, right? And so we have good reason, therefore, to think that that this is not parallel here. And I also mentioned the presence of embarrassing details, right, in the Gospel accounts, which you yourself also admit, right? Why say the woman discovered the tomb, right? So all these are markers of authenticity. Right, so even though, as you say, the Gospels are written decades later, but given all these reasons, we have good evidence, good reason to think that these accounts which are written decades later actually well preserved, preserve these details carefully. And even though it's decades later, but nevertheless, they are still early in the sense that they are written during the time of living memory, right? So I think I've said enough. There are multiple considerations for.
So I agree that the sources contain memories, but I think the memories have grown over the years. So my own view is that the story of the appearance to the 12 in Matthew 28 and the appearance to the 12 in Luke 24 and the appearance to the 12, the first appearance before Thomas to the 10, I guess it would be in John, with C.H. Dodd, I think they're all descended from the same story, which tells you that if that's true, which I think it is, they've all been modified here and there because Matthew's account isn't exactly Luke's account. So, as I do in the book, I look for things that are common to these stories and then argue that it's there we should be looking for memories. So I agree with you that there are memories here, and I agree that these stories were very important, but I don't believe that means that the earliest Christians were investigative reporters or that they were journalists who wanted to get everything down. I think they were also religious people, and I think sometimes their religious ideas have helped to enlarge and expand stories in certain directions. I don't know how further we can take this conversation.
Okay, let me reply to that. So for what I have so far.
I have one question. I have one question, Andrew. Jordan, do you have a comment? Do you have a query?
So I don't know how much we disagree, really. I mean, we maybe disagree at the end of the day on what sort of evidential value the resurrection has, but much of our disagreement, I think, turns on sort of our ability to prove, or not prove, render probable certain background assumptions. So I think that might be where our main disagreement is. And he does, the reason I bring this up, at least in part, is Dale does bring this up, for those of you who haven't read the book, near the end of his book. So he does have a short discussion of Timothy McGrew and Richard Swinburne and others like that.
And if I might say, Andrew, if you could hang on to your question and process something that Jordan just mentioned, which would fall into the category of Dale's query to you.
Yes.
Where are worldview discussions?
Yeah.
Hold on. We just, in a way, that's what you brought up, Jordan. And Dale, do you have any comment?
About worldview?
To what Jordan was just saying.
I guess at the end of the day, our thought is congruent, because what we're both doing is we're taking our belief in Jesus' resurrection and we're putting it into a larger context. Now, my context may be a little different, or my natural theology may be different from his, but basically I think it's the same move. After all, I think Jesus rose from the dead, and I don't think that I am irrational or insane, right? So,
on the one hand, but on the other hand, I have offered multiple reasons, embarrassing details and foundational importance, the fact that all this will be repeated again and again, to argue that the details have been, in fact, carefully preserved. And in fact, in any case, at the end of the day, I think Dale, you do agree with me that despite the differences, there are still common elements which they agree on, and these common elements are important. They include that Jesus identified himself, spoke to the people, unlike the case in Zyklin where Mary, the so-called Mary, never spoke, and also that Jesus was touched. So all these indications that indicate that he was bodily alive. And I also make another argument earlier on in my presentation that if the disciples didn't actually see the same thing, that it was a bodily Jesus that they actually saw together, they wouldn't have come to the belief that he was bodily resurrected in the first place, and they really to die for him. Then they would have believed that, okay, maybe it was just a vision, right, or some spirit. And so they would have come. I mean, the ancient people are aware of intramental hypothesis. They are aware that if people drink too much wine, they will start seeing things. They will start seeing different things, right? So. For all these multiple reasons, I don't think your best skeptical hypothesis work.
Okay, so gosh, there's so much to say here. One, I'll simply say that somewhere in the book, towards the beginning, I say that this is a collection of historical studies, and I'm not going to do religion, and I'm not going to do theology, and that's where things get really interesting. So, I did not write a book on worldviews. The book simply assumes that there are people who don't have my worldview. Now, maybe you think they shouldn't have it. I actually think materialism has been empirically falsified. So I'm to some extent in agreement with you, but that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is not to say, oh, I've done my study, and now let me write 500 more pages on worldview and background and plug everything into that. I just wasn't doing that. But I will say this. I think apologists sometimes overlook the fact that these disciples had been following Jesus for 1 to 2 or 3 years. They'd given everything away. Some of them had left families. They were alienated maybe from spouses, from parents, from their communities. They'd given everything for this cause. And I think Jesus was an eschatological individual, and they have the category of martyrdom and resurrection before anything happens. So if, here speaking on behalf of the skeptic, if the tomb somehow becomes empty, these are people who want the cause to go on. They're not going to say, oh no, they're going to want to find a reason to justify their commitment. And if somebody says the tomb is empty, Jesus gave them the categories, death and resurrection. So I don't think it's as easy to make this argument as...
Yeah, but you yourself agree that what is foundational to their belief about Jesus' resurrection is the appearance, not the empty tomb, right? They actually...
No, I think there are 3 elements to the origin of resurrection belief. 1, the appearances, 2, the empty tomb, and 3, the category of resurrection which was given to them before Easter by Jesus.
Yeah, but
you will remember Luke 19. Luke says...
Andrew, wait. Jordan will follow when Dale is done.
Just one sentence. Luke 19 says these people went up to Jerusalem thinking that the kingdom of God would appear immediately. That would involve the resurrection of the dead. That's what Luke says. I think he was right. That's all.
Interesting.
Okay, now I fear my question is going to take us back. But I think here might be a disagreement between you and I, perhaps. So you carve out like a middle space. You're right. You're not trying to do worldview. You're not trying to do natural theology. You're not trying to do any of that. You're doing historical analysis, and you're kind of posing some questions, laying out some data, and analyzing it. But you position your project. I take it that your main thesis to be something along the lines of the apologist doesn't prove her case, the skeptic doesn't prove his case. It's kind of compatible with either, depending on certain background assumptions. I guess my thought is we can't actually say that because these things are inextricable from these background considerations. I think what maybe... I don't like boundary lines, and this is what the historian can say, this is what the theologian can say. I think they're mostly artificial. But I think what maybe the historian could say is something like, they can conditionalize over certain things. Like, if you're interested, if you think God is likely or might be interested in, there is a God and might be interested in raising Jesus from the dead, well, given this data, you can really reasonably come to the conclusion that, that Jesus rose. If you don't have that, right, then it's probably going to be quite small. The probability that Jesus rose from the dead is going to be quite small. But I don't know that we can actually say that neither the skeptic nor the apologist succeeds without doing all this other project. I don't think you need to do that other project. I just don't know if that kind of main element of your thesis can in fact succeed.
Well, so first of all, I don't think the book has a thesis. I think it's a collection of studies. But I like historians to do as much as they can, but there are things that historians cannot do. We are quite limited in such things. And there are things we can argue about with everyone. Whether a guy named Jesus of Nazareth was crucified does not involve any metaphysical assumptions. Everything is in common, or can be in common, when we talk about that. But it changes when you start talking about Jesus rising from the dead, or God raising Jesus from the dead. That seems to be a very different issue. So what I'm dealing with throughout most of my book is stuff like crucifixion. Was the tomb empty? Right? Do people think they saw Jesus, and so on and so on? How old is this belief? And I make arguments that are addressed to all human beings, all rational human beings. But the book is not doing more than that. It was never intended to do more than that. Now, I have certain prejudice and biases. That's why I said on page 1, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But I went on to say, I've got doubts about things, and I'm going to do my darndest to report even-handedly on the debates. So, as I said, the book is more, I guess it's scholarship, but I'm an investigative reporter. So-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, so-and-so said this. Is that a good argument? You know, I will evaluate the testimony from time to time, but I'm interested in tracing what people are saying and looking at the arguments and unpacking them chapter by chapter. They don't go together to make a whole at the end. So that's why, again, in the preface it says, I did not finish writing this book. I abandoned it. I just stopped.
You know, I think a lot of us on the stage, when we have written on the resurrection, we're not writing as theologians. We're not writing. You said you're a critical historian, and I think that's what we're trying to do too. Just because we come with a more conservative conclusion than you do, doesn't mean we're not critical. We're trying to do these things as well. So it's like a critic, a movie critic. You know, you're looking at it for the positives and negatives. You're trying to do it apart from one's worldview. We're trying that as well. We're more sanguine about our conclusions than you are. And you asked, okay, you said, Mike said the resurrection hypothesis is superior, and you said, to who? Well, I would say, my answer to that would be, it's superior to competing hypotheses because it fulfills the arguments of inference to the best explanation. It's better than alternative hypotheses in that way. But if you're saying to who, it sounds to me like you're thinking, all right, well, you think that it's a superior hypothesis because of the reasons you give. It has better explanatory scope, power, it's less ad hoc, it's more plausible, but others may not think the same thing. Well, that just means they're wrong. This is something my wife and I talk about at times, and with the politics, it's like, all right, we are split as a country right now. You got the right, and you got the radical left. And so we'll be talking, and my wife and I are both on the right, and she'll say, yeah, but people on the radical left think they're just as correct as we do. I said, yeah, but they are wrong. Well, how do you know that? Well, because they can't even tell the difference between a man and a woman and do that. Of course they're wrong. Their logic is terrible. Their arguments are bad. We assess the arguments. You said a moment ago, you're not crazy, you're not insane. Well, someone could say, you believe that Jesus rose. Of course you're insane. And you would say, no, I'm not. I've got reasons for believing I'm not insane. It's the arguments that account. It's not the fact that you can't convince others that make the difference. It's the arguments that are used because someone is wrong.
Okay, but you can't always decide from history who is right and who is wrong. And in this case, I think it's different than the crucifixion. Heck, I think it's different than Zaitun. I don't know anything to say about Zaitun that makes sense, other than it was married or a something we know not what. But I remain convinced, I haven't heard anything today, maybe that's just because I'm stubborn, I haven't heard anything today that makes me think that the skeptical hypothesis that I put forward in the book is crazy. It does involve improbability, but I don't understand why that improbability outweighs the improbability of a dead guy coming back. Now, the only way to do that is to do what Jordan does and bring everything else in. And if you want to do that, that's fine, but it's not what the book is about.
Gary, do you have anything to add?
You ask professors that, and they're used to talking for hours and hours. Dale, what you just said a second ago, and back to Mike's question, I mean, I think we've all said one way or another, we can appreciate you bringing a more skeptical mindset than us. But what I'm curious about is you still, and you've said this 5 times tonight, you still end up with all the skepticism saying, well, you know, in your first book, you said empty tomb is, you'll go barely positive with it, but the other view is okay. And then here you're a little more positive in this one, it seems. What I'm saying is with all your skeptical thoughts, you still come down to the side of belief in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And of course, in your own life, you know, you have testimonies in both books, but here in particular where you have the testimonies about the Allison family, those cases in your own life are very important to you, aren't they? I mean, those.
Yeah, sure.
And so one reason you can't give it up is because you've been there and done that with a few of these cases. You've seen, dare I say, the other side. So what I'm saying, I guess, the one point I would be making is this: given your greater skepticism than we have, we still come down to the same side of the fence on the truth of the resurrection of Jesus.
Yes, but I don't know how to formulate that as the conclusion of an argument.
But you have reasons too.
I
You give a
have
number of good reasons.
but these reasons are not enough to persuade everybody. And I start out in the book by saying that I'm a multiple personality, and then I do have a skeptic in me. So I have a believer in me, but I also have a skeptic in me. And this skeptic has studied Sabbatai Tzvi and Jewish millenarian movements, and it knows how crazy religious people can be, and it knows how legends get started and so on.
Right.
It knows all about folklore, so it's never going to be stilled or sanguine. It's always going to be there saying, but maybe you're wrong about this.
With Sabbatai Tzvi, you know, you mentioned Sabbatai Tzvi today. You said, talk about reports of miracles. You got reports of miracles in Sabbatai, but problem is Nathan, his forerunner, his John the Baptist, said there are no miracles. We don't need them for belief. And also, when Sabbatai was confronted with becoming a Muslim or staying the Jewish Messiah, he became a Muslim. And then he told his people they should convert to Islam. What I mean is, this guy's kind of going back and forth on worldview changes, and then he finally dies in captivity. So there's just a lot of...
I'm not defending
No, you're
Sabbatai
not.
Tzvi.
I
think
think you are.
Sabbatai Tzvi had mental problems, but I do know that there were followers of his who kept on following him after he apostatized. And they said, well, it's possible that the Messiah has to go to hell in order to redeem humanity, so this is the worst thing that can happen. He's apostatized and so on. Religious people can rationalize anything.
And there is a major part of Chabad Judaism that is still following Sabbatai Tzvi. But we need to move to you, the audience, and if we have time, we can have inputs. If you would stand and state your question shortly. We have just the remainder of our time. I'm aware that Andrew has stuff to say, but here we have these people to say. Let's begin with this brother. Can you state your question in 1 or 2 sentences? Because I know you have a lot to say.
No. Actually, I don't have a...
No, you don't. We can't hear your lecture. I know you're very competent.
A very quick question.
I have to have a question, yeah.
Okay. The quick question is that I heard from George Box a mathematical solution. They said, wonderful model, but all models are wrong. But some models are more useful than others. My question is that, given all this modeling, wonderful and very educational sharing, and thanks to the panelists, and I find a universally accepted method in this causality induction, because the FDA, they have a...
Wait, is that your question?
Yeah.
Is there a universally accepted method?
The universal accepted method is the causality induction from, surprisingly, the FDA.
Yeah, okay, that's the question. Dale, is there a universal methodology that you're resisting, I might suggest, that would satisfy our questioner?
If there is, I don't know about it. I need to be enlightened.
Sir?
So this is a question for the panel for some apologetic perspective. Dale's reluctant about the physical details about Jesus' resurrection. I would contend that they're important to establish as veridical, to leave open the so as to not leave open the plausibility of some sort of subjective or objective vision. The Orthodox view is bodily resurrection. Anything other than that is a competing hypothesis. It eats away at the probability space of bodily resurrection. What parts of Dale's work help the defender of bodily resurrection best, in your view? Dale, I know that's not the purpose of your book. I'm talking about how I've heard them speak about it. That's all. It might be none, but I've heard other things.
The big question is, no one's disputing bodily resurrection here. But,
He doesn't affirm bodily resurrection.
Of course he does.
Dale?
He does, yes.
You affirm
Over and
bodily...
over again. Okay, sir,
No, he
back
doesn't.
here. We need the next question.
That's nonsense. That's not true.
Okay.
He says over and over that the New Testament view of Paul and the others is that Jesus was raised bodily.
Yeah.
Wait, show me. What page?
I'll give you a whole list of them.
Okay.
Okay.
You and Gary can talk afterward, sir.
Because that's not true.
Okay, thank you.
Very quick questions. Thank you, everybody. I have one. The question is kind of provocative, but it's history, science. The second is, Dale, I want to ask you, why, in spite of all these very clear-full points, you still believe in the bodily resurrection? Thank you.
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, I suppose it's because I am a Christian, and because Christianity, while it doesn't explain all sorts of things, explains enough for me to be satisfied with it. So it's actually a sort of old Basil Mitchell type argument at the end of the day. But I also, in my old age, I hate to say this, I always wanted to argue for everything, but in my old age, I'm tired. There's a sort of William James pragmatist in there now, and it's what I know, it's how I get through life. I couldn't do anything else at this point. I couldn't become a Tibetan Buddhist. Too tired to learn the tradition. And this one has worked well enough for me. So that's a sort of cop-out that my younger self would have screamed about. But if I'm being honest, I think it's true.
Maybe we could ask this lady.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Allison. In fact, I found very fascinating your line of thinking. And I study psychology, and I just couldn't stop thinking. First of all, who's your audience of this book? And would it be ridiculous to suggest that this was just a thought experiment, kind of divorced, like you're saying, theology, honestly, history? Forgive me, but as a historian part, I see more rhetoric, I see more philosophical approach to it, again, as a thought experiment. And again, would it be more ridiculous to suggest if you were to add a component of theological, metaphysical, like, Mary of Fatima perhaps was a demonic appearance, so which makes it an anomaly. So there perhaps a miraculous event, and Galatians 1:8 suggests that it comes an angel of light. And therefore, one more pending question. Therefore, Jesus claims to be divine, and therefore he predicted his own death and resurrection several times. So how do you grapple with this? Who's your audience in this sense?
Okay, so my answer to that is really unenlightening. The honest answer is I write books to convince myself about certain things. I never say I know what I think and then write a book to support it, because that would bore me completely. So I'm simply blessed or lucky enough to be able to write books to myself that for some reason publishers want to publish. But I don't address them to other people. I'm always talking to myself, to one of my multiples inside of me.
Folks, I don't do 10 seconds, so help me. I'm defending Dale.
He's gone, but...
Okay. Bodily resurrection for New Testament writers, pages 131 to 136 and 224 to 225 of his second book on resurrection.
Excellent. Sir?
I wanted to thank all of you for the conversation today. I have a question specifically for you, Dr. Allison. I found your comments in your book about tomb veneration very compelling. However, I was reading James Dunn, Jesus Remembered, and he argues that for tomb veneration, because it was so frequent in the ancient world during the time of Jesus, that we would have expected, if there were tomb veneration, that it would be mentioned in the historical sources that we do have. It's not, therefore he concludes there wasn't any tomb veneration. Could you respond?
So, one of the problems with writing a book to yourself is that when you're done, you don't think about it anymore. So I have no idea what I said about tomb veneration. I haven't thought about this. I don't know what my argument is. I will say that I have been convinced that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is probably the right place, which means I think there was a memory. Now, I don't know whether it was venerated or whatnot, but I don't think it just pops up in the 2nd century. I think they always knew where it was, but all attempts to explain what was going on, if anything, there in the 1st century leave me unconvinced.
Sir, back here. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Thank you
my
for your
question is
question.
for Dale Allison. So, Mike Icona had objected to how you say that Hindu and Buddhist traditions also have interpretations of the events that happened with Jesus. And when responding to that, I think you mentioned Zaitun in Egypt. But I'd say it seems not comparable, because in the case of the resurrection, we have the person directly presenting an interpretation of the miraculous events. So in the case of, maybe I'm missing something about Zaitun, and but doesn't that strengthen the idea that if Jesus really rose, then what he claimed was true, and what his disciples claimed that he claimed was true?
Okay, my point about Zaitun is, one, I find it inexplicable, and two, I find it the reports of the witnesses to be utterly baffling. You really should go read them. And after reading the 50th one, you're going to be thinking, is this Mary? There's no way around it, okay? And that's my point. It's not to do anything with Zaitun directly. I'm not directly connecting. I'm saying, actually, I think the purpose of the chapter was to say, here's some kind of mass appearance, which isn't explicable and which I can't explain. And what does this mean in general? It means for me that when people say an appearance to the 500 and they say it must have just been nonsense, right? I say, well, maybe not, because I know of something else that I don't know how to explain. So maybe if we were there with the 500, we wouldn't be able to explain that either. But that's the main point of the chapter, if I recall rightly.
Yeah, but in your response to it, in your main presentation, you mentioned that specifically as a response to Mike Icona's point about Buddhist and Hindu interpretations. So would you agree then that the fact that Jesus made specific theological claims and that his disciples reported specific theological claims make the Christian interpretation of the miracle, if it happened, much more likely than any other possible interpretation, like
Yeah,
Hindu and Buddhist.
okay, that's fine from a Christian point of view, but if you're a skeptic is going to have no trouble saying that all the post-Easter words of Jesus were not said by Jesus of Nazareth. That's just what they're going to say. Look, I grew up I was reading Bultmann as a teenager. Bultmann was a very bright man. Wouldn't for a second think that Jesus said any of those things, right? So you have to presuppose that they're authentic in order to argue the case, which you might think is some kind of circular reasoning. I don't know, I haven't thought through it, but maybe.
Sir, yes.
So thanks, Dr. Allison, for all the questions you already answered, but I just want to pick up on a point that you were making, I think in response to one of the questions. So it was when you said, these people have lived with Jesus, they've given up their jobs. So I guess just trying to work out a little bit more about, get a bit more clarity on the argument. So is that an argument kind of from cognitive dissonance to say that cognitive dissonance gave rise to these visions or possibilities? I guess it's...
No, it's not cognitive dissonance because, again, from the skeptical point of view, there was nothing dissonant about what happened. If Jesus had predicted death and resurrection or the eschatological tribulation followed by general resurrection, then they could plug in what happened to them without great problem. So you can read in John that, they were afraid of the Jews, so they were in locked rooms, but that doesn't tell you about their theological process, what they were thinking, how they were putting ideas together. And I don't think it was as difficult as people think.
Sir?
Again, if you've got the category of resurrection handed to you by your guide, and you think it's going to happen soon, and somebody says the tomb was empty, and then one or more individual has said, we saw him, I don't think it's going to take that much to say, maybe the resurrection has begun here.
Sir?
So not necessarily the cognitive...
Okay.
So, there's no dissonance there. It's just,
sir,
our guy died, we're not happy about it, but can't really say it was unexpected.
What about Paul and James? They weren't expecting.
I'm sorry, pardon?
What about Paul and James? They weren't expecting the resurrection.
So, Paul, that's true, okay? James, we have no idea. We don't know when that appearance took place. It might have taken place after Pentecost, after he'd been in the church for 6 months. We have no idea. If you honestly think about it, we don't. So James is often modeled on Paul, but I see absolutely no reason to think this. Now, in the pre-Easter period, the family is hostile, right? But Mary's there at the cross. Maybe James reconciled himself to Jesus' cause in the first year of the church, and Jesus appeared to him after that. We just don't know anything about this appearance. The only version we have of it is in Jerome, and there's not a single person I've ever run across who says it's anything but a legend. So we don't know. Paul, yes, not.
Last question. Yes, you in the hoodie.
So first of all, thank you so much. For me, this was the best session. My question is, it may be ignorant. So I'm a medical physician, an associate professor at our medical school, so I do some clinical research. So the question is related to probability, because in medical research, we investigate probability, but I understand in the humanities you might define it differently. So my question is, how do you measure probability? You use the term probability, and it sounds like you disagree on which argument is more probable. So in clinical research, we can run it through a multivariate logistic regression to measure likelihoods. But then if you have differing opinions and different biases coming into this, and you're talking about maybe minor or maybe nuanced disagreements, how do you then have a shared mental map to measure which argument is more probable than the other?
Yes, there's the academic medicine approach.
No, Dale, please respond.
I don't think we have such a thing. I don't think we ever will. And if we ever do, we can just plug the numbers into AI and ask it all our theological, philosophical, and historical questions, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think human beings are not reducible to numbers or to equations, and the history is what human beings do and have done, and where that thing things that way. Also think that probability is in the eye of the beholder, and it to a great extent depends upon what you yourself have witnessed.
I disagree. I think we can use arguments of inference to the best explanation. Does the hypothesis, how does it fulfill explanatory scope, explanatory power? Is it less ad hoc? Plausibility involved. To the extent a hypothesis fulfills those criteria, it may be said to be probable. A lot of historians do have a spectrum of historical certainty. In the middle is indeterminate, then you go to improbability, then you go toward probability or confidence. And a lot of historians will say if it's more probable than not, in terms of outdistancing competing hypotheses, then that would be something that would be regarded as probably what happened.
Could we thank our panel? This is Method and Systematic Theology. Please rate us on our webpage, on the website, and send in your recommendations. The category for method, that's possible already, heresiology. What is systematic theological method on heresy? Political theology. We have major American challenges for systematic theology and other suggestions. God bless you. Have a great rest of the weekend if you're still here. Thank you for your attendance.